In this week's episode of One Piece, Rebecca and Kyros have a heartfelt reunion, and Fujitora is on the move, trying to hunt down Luffy and Trafalgar Law. Whether or not you like this week's episode of One Piece will be determined by how much you actually like the backstories of Rebecca and Kyros. For me personally, I'm kind of over the entire backstory of Rebecca and Kyros and pretty much all of the random citizens of Dressrosa at this point. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this week's episode still managed to hit me right in the feels. The reunion between Rebecca and Kyros was really handled quite well, aside from the fact that about 75% of this episode was just watching Rebecca tumble and fall through the woods, which is a little strange because she held herself pretty good in Kurita Coliseum, but in this week's episode, she's busting all sorts of ass. And there's a lot of flashbacks with her and the toy soldier and her remembering Kyros, but really it's all about that moment where she finally is reunited with her father Kyros, and Kyros' reactions in this episode were just so amazing because we've always known him as being the super tough guy, the hardened killer, but we got to see a completely different side of Kyros in this episode, not only from his reunion with his daughter, but in some of the flashbacks. I love that he doesn't even want to touch Rebecca as a child because he's afraid that he will taint her, so he has to literally put on gloves just to hold his own daughter. But it really does show that despite the fact that Kyros is like such a badass, he's a softie at heart. He truly does love his daughter. The biggest surprise of this week's episode, of course, is getting to see Fujitora on the attack. After all the stuff with Rebecca and Kyros, we go to the scene where all of the Straw Hat Pirates and the fighters from Kurita Coliseum have made their way to the edge of Dressrosa, and right as they're getting ready to escape and wait for Luffy, suddenly Fujitora appears riding on a rock and getting ready to kick some ass. There was a little bit of lost potential in this episode, and this also goes for the manga version as well, as it almost seems like Zoro and Fujitora are about to have an amazing battle. Unfortunately, it is cut very short. However, it's a build-up to some even bigger events in the next episode of the series, and if you look at the preview for it, it looks awesome. Spoiler warning, Fujitora versus Luffy. That's right, that is how you're going to end a really kick-ass arc, by adding on another surprise battle. So what's the rundown on this week's episode of One Piece? Honestly, guys, I just don't have that much to say about this episode. It definitely wasn't my favorite episode from the Dressrosa arc, and I thought it was a little long-winded, but a lot of that has to do with my personal opinion that I'm just sort of done with the Dressrosa arc at this point. I just don't really care about any of the backstory or them wrapping it up anymore. Does that make this a bad episode? Absolutely not. This is one of the more heartfelt episodes that I've actually seen from the Dressrosa arc, and a lot of people are going to get different things from this episode. The reunion between Rebecca and Kyros was a long time coming, but it was handled so well in this episode, and you can truly feel the love between both of those characters. And then, of course, there's all the stuff at the end with Fujitora coming in, riding on that rock, bringing out his sword. Man, that moment was just so damned cool. He's such an awesome character, and the fact that all of these guys have to defend against him really is a testament to his strength and his power. And of course, there's going to be that big, amazing build-up for the battle with him and Luffy much later in the next episode, which I really just cannot wait to see. Other big developments from this episode, of course, is you get this great moment between Sengoku and Trafalgar Law, with Sengoku basically just letting Law know that Rosinante to him was basically a son, and he lost his son because he actually had to save Trafalgar Law. The scene started out really heartfelt between the two, but became very tense by the end of the episode, and they didn't really show you where that was going to go because that was our big to-be-continued moment of this week's episode of One Piece, but I'm sure it's going to be the beginning of next week's episode as we lead into the next big battle of the series. Otherwise, this was just another okay episode, an extension of last week's story of Luffy and Rebecca running around Dressrosa Kingdom, eventually letting her go so that she could finally be reunited with her father, which, like I said, was a very tender moment and was handled very well. It's also worth noting that this week's episode had some pretty decent animation and artwork by One Piece standards, so this was definitely a very watchable episode of One Piece. A lot of people are going to have different scores for this one. For me, this was kind of an average episode of One Piece, so I'm going to drop a 3 out of 5 this week. Still, this is an episode that all One Piece fans should definitely check out, especially if you're only watching the anime version. But if you're a manga enthusiast, check out this week's episode. You might see a few scenes that you really like. So that's my thoughts on this week's episode of One Piece, but I want to hear from you guys. What did you think about this week's episode of One Piece? Did you enjoy the reunion between Rebecca and Kyros? Did you have to bust out the tissues because you were crying? And what did you think of Fujitora getting ready to go into battle? What do you want to see in the battle between Luffy and Fujitora and the rest of the One Piece anime series? Please tell me in the comment section below. You guys are awesome! Thank you for watching this review. I really appreciate it. If you want to help subscribe to the channel, maybe you could hit that like button right down below. Maybe you could subscribe to the channel. That way you'll be able to see all of our latest anime and manga reviews and our weekly podcast show, The Powerful Nerdcast. Make sure to check that out. You guys can find links for that, all types of other cool stuff in the description box below. Thank you guys again for watching, and as always, stay dandy, baby.